Hi everybody, Peggy McGuire here for English 104, and today we talk about the Analytical Research Report. So you have already identified a problem, an issue, a question, a problem that needs to be addressed. You have thought about who to propose to address that problem, that question, that issue, and you have written a proposal in which you have argued that you can do the research necessary to address that question, solve that problem, and you can come up with good recommendations, and you have the expertise and resources to do the best job. So, your proposal has been accepted, and now it's time to actually get down to the research, the analysis of that research, and then the writing of the report to the person who asked you to do it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'll just warn you up front that this is going to be a sort of long presentation because there's a lot to say. And basically what I'm going to do is talk about three major areas. I'm going to first talk about what analytical research is, and then I'm going to drill down a little further to talk about the analytical part of that analytical research. I think most of us know what research is, but what about analysis? What makes research analytical research? So we'll talk about analysis and what that looks like. And then finally, we'll talk about the parts of a well-written, strong analytical research report. So, started. So first, our definition. So an analytical research report is going to be a lengthy discussion which leads to a set of recommendations concerning how to solve a problem or answer a question or address an issue. What this report does is tell its reader what we know about the issue or the problem based on the information that we've gathered through our research about the problem or the question or the issue. Then, once we tell the reader what we know, then we tell the reader what we can conclude from the information that we gathered. What conclusions can we draw? And then finally, if those are our conclusions, then here is what we need to do or we need to not do in order to address the problem, answer the question. Okay? So, this is a pretty intense and complex job we're talking about. So to complete this kind of report, first thing we need to do is do the research to learn all we can about the problem or the question. Then, when we do our research and we analyze it, we identify options for solving the problem or answering the questions. And, very important, in the process of coming up with options, we also then have to compare the advantages and disadvantages of each of the options we come up with. And we do that by using what we call criteria for feasibility. How feasible is each of the options that we've come up with? Because only by doing that comparison can we decide which are the best options, which are the options that will most likely get us to a solution. All right? So let's talk about these criteria for feasibility. To choose the best options, which become our recommendations, we always think about three things. All right? For each option, we think about how much will it cost to pursue this option? How safe will it be to pursue this option? And how much time it will take to pursue this option. So for each of our options, our audience is primarily going to be concerned about cost, safety, and time. So to be responsible and responsive to our audience, we have to look at those three areas for any option we think about. So you might have figured out how important it is to know your audience for this kind of report. Because almost always somebody who's asking you to do this kind of research is some decision maker. And so decision makers need good information upon which to make decisions. It might be government officials, it might be corporate managers, it might be board members, some high-level person in an organization that needs the information in order to make decisions that that organization will accept. Or it could be an individual or a team or a series of people with differing roles within an organization. So you have to know whether you're talking to one person, whether you're talking to a group of people, or a group of people who play different roles within the organization. Knowing your audience is critical. And then, big surprise, right along with audience, knowing your purpose. Purpose, audience, always linked in good writing of this kind. So, while I'm thinking about who my audience is and what they expect, I am also thinking about what questions this report needs to ultimately answer. Because that's my purpose, right? To answer the question, to propose solutions to a problem. Why is this topic important now? Why do we have to deal with this? Why do you, who I'm talking to, my audience, need to put your resources into solving this problem now? Why can't it wait? And then, how will the information we provide be useful to you in solving the problem? So that's my purpose as the writer here, is to make sure that what I say is answering the questions I want to answer, and that the reason I'm doing this is important. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture of what analytical research is going to accomplish, focusing on who needs it and my response to that need. So, let's look at this business of analytical. What makes a report analytical as opposed to a simple research report? Not simple may not be the best word, but why do we call it analytical? And the analytical piece is about the story you tell in your report, not just about the information you gathered, but about your thinking about that information. So your research is where you gathered the information that you needed, but your analysis is where you tell me, as your audience, what you think about the information that you gathered and how you think that information can help solve a problem. So it is really a story that you're telling to your reader. You're telling your reader about the exploration that you did through your research. You're telling your reader about the evidence you found as a result. Then you're telling your reader, and this is the trickier but much more important part, about your reasoning, the thinking you did, the decision making you did as you looked at that information that you gathered. What did it make you think? That's what I want to know, because it's what I need to think also. Okay? And then finally, your story ends with the conclusions that you drew based on your thinking about the evidence. And those conclusions are what you come to me with as recommendations. Alright? So that's the story you're telling. What I did, what I found, what I thought about what I found, and then the conclusions I drew based on what I found. That's analysis. And we have some specific forms of analysis that we can use depending on our context, depending on what we're trying to accomplish, depending on the kind of problem we're trying to solve or the question we're trying to answer. So the first kind of analysis we can do is what we call causal analysis. And that is, you're looking for the cause of a problem. So you're trying to uncover why a problem is a problem. What makes this a problem? That's what causal analysis does. So here are a couple of examples that I'll use throughout this discussion. So, for instance, why are NASA's accomplishments not more widely recognized by the public? Let's say, now, if NASA is asking you to do some research to come up with some recommendations about how to make sure the public is more aware of what they do so that they can get more funding from the government, from the public's taxes, then one of the things you might want to learn as a part of that analytical research is why this is a problem. Why doesn't the public know more about what NASA does? So that would be a causal analysis. Or let's flip it over. Let's talk about something, an environmental issue of great importance right now, which is the Eastern Pacific Garbage Patch, which is this huge area in the Eastern Pacific that is full of garbage that has come from all over the world. And a group of scientists are trying to figure out what to do about this awful environmental disaster. Well, one thing that the research might reveal is, why is this a problem? What is the cause of this mess in the Eastern Pacific that we call the garbage patch? So a causal analysis would get at why did that garbage patch appear? Okay? So that would be the causes. But we could also be looking at what are the effects as a causal analysis. So back to NASA. How does decreased funding for NASA impact everyday citizens? Or how is the garbage patch affecting local marine life? So here your causal analysis focuses on what's happening as a result of this problem that we've identified, or question that we need to answer. Right? Both of those could be a causal analysis. A second form of analysis you might be doing, depending on the kind of problem you're pursuing, is to look at competing ideas or options for solving a problem based on some specific criteria. So with our NASA example, saying the research question we're going to pursue is, what would be the most effective public education strategies for NASA to employ? So we've already identified the problem. The public doesn't know enough about NASA's work. So my research is going to focus on figuring out what would be the most effective ways to reach the public better. Okay? And that means you're going to be looking at several different possibilities, and you're going to be comparing them to try to come up with a recommendation for what's the best way, what's the most effective way. With our garbage patch example, we're going to be looking at several options, we hope, for cleaning up the garbage patch, and then say which option for cleaning up the patch is most likely to be successful. So you're going to compare options in order to come up with a recommendation for the best option. The key here in this kind of analysis is to be clear about what our criteria are. In other words, whenever I use that criteria, what I'm talking about is, when I say effective, what do I mean by effective? Or when I say successful, what do I mean by successful? So with NASA, what would be effective public response to NASA? What would be the best scenario for the public's understanding of what NASA does? Or if we're talking about the garbage patch, how will I know that the cleaning up the garbage patch is successful? What does that mean? What would successful mean? Would it disappear? Would it be lessened? Shrunken in size? Would the countries who are contributing to the trash stop doing that? So you have to be really clear in your mind, if you're doing a comparative analysis, what do I mean by an effective response? What do I mean by a successful outcome? And be really clear and define that as part of your discussion. And then the third form of analysis we can look at is feasibility. So I have an option, and now I have to evaluate how practical that option is, that idea, that plan. Here's a plan that we could pursue. But can this plan be pursued? Can it be done? Will it work? Is it a good, sound idea? So my analysis is actually saying, here's an option we came up with. Now we're going to look at its feasibility. We're going to look at whether or not it's likely to work. All right. So back to our examples. So let's say that we're thinking that the government really ought to invest a lot of new money into a public education initiative for NASA. So my research question would be, should the government do that? Is that the best option here for the government to be putting a lot of new money into a public education initiative related to NASA? Is that the best option? If so, yes. If not, why not? Or with our garbage patch, let's say we say that, several countries who are contributing to the problem of the garbage patch need to get together and decide themselves on a cleanup plan. But is that doable? Will it work? Is it a good idea? That's what our analysis is going to be. All right? So that's what we mean again by feasibility. Will this work? Is it practical? Can it be done? Is it a sound idea? Is it a good option to address the problem we have or the question we need to answer? Okay, so I choose one or more methods of analyzing the data that I've collected through my research. And now I want to make sure that the analysis I do of that information is good and sound. How do I know it's going to be good, sound, effective? So here I'm defining effective here. So if my analysis is effective, first, it will precisely identify the problem to be solved or the question to be answered. So it will clearly state, without any wishy-washy or question, what is the problem to be solved? What is the question to be answered? My effective analysis will also identify if there are any other questions, sort of subordinate questions, that the main problem or the main question implies. So are there, other considerations that have to be brought out related to my main problem or my main question? My analysis, if it's effective, will include a clear statement of my purpose in writing the report, as the writer of the report. What am I going to do in this report? My good, effective analysis will include enough information to be able to have an in-depth discussion of the issue that is appropriate to the targeted audience. And there always, again, you have to think about who are you writing this to and for. And how much do they know? How much do they need to know? Right? Because if you don't think about that ahead of time, you may end up confusing the issue and confusing the reader if you use either too much information or too little information. And if you confuse the issue with too much or too little info, then your reader is less able to make decisions based on it, because questions keep coming up. Lack of clarification, need for more information. You want to make the decisions about how much information carefully so that when your audience reads it, they don't have to ask more questions, or at least the very minimal kinds of clarification. Right? And if my analysis is effective, it will present the information that I've gathered accurately. This is the fair and balanced approach here. No bias. I'm telling you honestly what I found. Right? Not what I wanted to find, what I hoped I'd find, but what I found. Fair and balanced. My effective analysis will then fully explain the meaning and significance of the information and the findings that I present to you. All right? See, again, this isn't just presenting information, it's presenting how I think about the information. So this is where the thinking comes in. I have to explain to you how I think, how I reason about the information I gathered so that I can give you a sense of its meaning and its significance. That's what I want to be able to do. So that's where the real analysis comes in. And in doing that, I avoid bias and I try to be as impartial as possible as I interpret the evidence. All right, so part of an effective analysis is your reader being able to trust that you are honestly explaining the meaning and importance of the information that you gathered, honestly according to your thoughtful analysis. And in a report like this, you want to use appropriate visuals as much as possible, liberally, and make sure that you interpret each of those visuals so that there's no question in the reader's mind why that visual is there or what it means. So you definitely want to get that visual piece into a report like this as appropriate. And then, as with any good persuasive piece of work, you want all of this information and analysis of the information to smoothly and logically lead to the conclusions that you present, to the recommendations that you make. So as I'm reading, it makes perfect sense to me by the time you get to your recommendations that you made those recommendations. So the whole report needs to logically flow toward them. Because what you're saying is these are the overall judgments I'm making about what the information means. And then, after I discuss what it all means, I recommend what should be done, or what should not be done. I should add there. All right? So, that logical flow of presenting the information fairly and clearly analyzing the information brings me to what it all means and what we should do. That's a good, effective analysis. And here is possibly the most challenging piece for the writer. Through this whole process of presenting information, analyzing the information, drawing conclusions about the information, making recommendations about the information, through that whole process, you need to be constantly checking to make sure that nothing is going wrong or that any obstacles aren't getting in your way of an effective analysis. So if there's a problem, you acknowledge it immediately, you locate the source of the problem, and you revise or improve your analysis as needed. All right? It could be that you think you have all the information you need, and then all of a sudden, a week before the report's due, some new piece of research becomes available to you that seems to contradict what you've decided to recommend. What do? You have to acknowledge that. If you don't acknowledge it, then you're not being an honest broker of the information. So hopefully that won't happen, but you have to make sure that all along the way you're paying attention to what could go wrong and making sure that if something gets in your way, that you acknowledge it and you deal with it. And if necessary, you revise your report. You may end up changing your recommendations based on new information that you didn't have access to earlier. That's the responsible way to do this. It's tough, but it's the responsible way to do it. And you have to be open to that possibility if you're going to be an honest broker of good recommendations. Okay. All right, so that's the process. Now, here's what a report looks like. Here are the pieces of your analytical research report. And, as we work through this, we're going to be very detailed in it, but it still ends up looking like a really good piece of persuasive writing. A really good, well-researched piece of persuasive writing, as most of the work we're doing does. All right, so you've got an introduction to your report. in which your job is to engage your reader. Even though your reader has actually commissioned this from you, you still have to make sure that the reader wants to keep reading what you present. So, to engage your reader, you want to clearly identify the topic, its origin, its importance. You clearly define the problem or the question to be addressed. You clearly explain the purpose of the report. Briefly, in the introduction, describe your research methodology. How did you do this research? What are your sources? Where did you go to find them? How many different kinds of sources did you use? Right? In your introduction, if necessary, you also list what we call working definitions. This is when you've got not like 25 terms, but 2 or 3 key terms that you're going to be using throughout the report. So you want to right up front say what they mean. That's what we mean by working definitions. A few key terms that you'll be using throughout the report, and you want to make sure up front that your reader knows what they mean. And your introduction should preview your recommendations. So give a little preview of what's to come in terms of what you concluded based on your research. Those are the ways to get your reader interested and want to keep reading. Then the body of your analytical research report presents the data that you've collected through your research. All right? It describes and explains your research findings, evidence, your interpretation of the evidence, and the reasoning you did about that evidence, which led you to your conclusion. That's the big deal. That's what the data is. The evidence, your analysis of the evidence, and the decisions that you made based on that evidence. Okay. Because this is going to be a complex report, it is highly likely that you need to divide it into subtopics. And each of those subtopics should have an informative header and address each subtopic fully and fairly. All right? So your headers are going to be very important, as you'll see in this paper, as you break it up into pieces. And by the way, this would be a good time to tell you that the reading that I asked you to do for this week has some really good examples and models of these parts of an analytical research report for you to look at. So please make sure you look at the models to see. In fact, you might want to have that open as you continue to listen here and go along with me to look at the parts of a report that I'm talking about. And then the last major part is a conclusion. And the conclusion is where you answer the question that you started with. Or you propose a solution to the problem that you started with and that caused you to do the analysis. Right? You summarize what you've said about your research findings. You summarize your interpretation of those research findings. And then you set out your recommendations. And those recommendations would be consistent with your purposes, the purposes of the report, all the evidence presented, and your interpretation of that evidence. So by the time you get to your recommendations, there should be no surprises. It should, again, logically, I should be able to logically see how what you recommend flows out of the research you did and your analysis of that research. It would be very rare that I would be surprised if you've done your job by the recommendations you put forth. So that's the main body, as I said, of any good persuasive essay. So that's what goes into the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. But an analytical research report is also going to contain a number of other pieces. A lot of it is what we call front matter, stuff that comes before the actual report that we just talked about. All right. The first piece of front matter is what we call the letter of transmittal. It is a brief letter. It is actually a letter. Brief letter, which is addressed to a particular audience, whoever it was that commissioned the report from you, to present the finished product. All right? So it's a letter that says, here is the report that you asked us to write. What the letter of transmittal may also do, and it is a fairly brief document, but what it may also do is, and you really should, acknowledge anyone who helped with the report. So your team members, but also if there's anyone else who was especially helpful to you in your ability to generate this report, it would be nice to acknowledge them in this letter of transmittal. The letter of transmittal can also point out to the reader especially important sections of the report. If you think that there's a particular part of the report that the reader really needs to pay attention to, you can say that in the letter of transmittal. Focus your reader's attention where you want it focused. You could here, if necessary, discuss any limitations or problems that you ran into that you believe affected your research and your findings. If you want to make any personal or off-the-record observations about the research or the conclusions you drew from it, this would be the place to do it in this letter. And then finally, and importantly, the letter needs to urge the reader to take the action that you are recommending. And by the way, it can't hurt also to say thank you. Thank you for letting us do this work. Okay? All right, next piece of front matter is the title page. The title page is extremely structured and regimented. Here and only this is what goes on your title page. You have a document title, which appears in the most prominent and highest position on the page, which fully describes the subject and purpose of the report. Okay, nothing cute, nothing glib, a very clear title that says this is the subject and purpose of this report. Okay. Below your document title, the names of all the authors and their affiliations. And then below the names, the date that the report is submitted. And that, by the way, for you, for this report would be the last class, the date of the last class. Next piece of front matter, table of contents. Extremely important, and very important that you put it together exactly as it needs to be put together. So, what you want first in your table of contents are each major section of the paper. Remember those headers? Well, that's what those headers are for, to break out each major section of the paper. Okay? So, for the front matter stuff that comes before it, we use Roman numerals, lowercase Roman numerals. For the main report, we use Arabic numbers, 1, 2, 3. All right? This does not include the letter of transmittal. So the letter of transmittal has no page number. The title page has no page number. And the table of contents has no page number. All right? So you don't include any of those. What you do include is a list of tables and figures, an abstract, or the executive summary, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Now, back to those headings and subheadings. For the table of contents to make any sense, the headings and subheadings on the table of contents must exactly match the headings and subheadings that are in the report text. So each of those headers has to appear exactly the same way in the text and in the table of contents, with the page number where they appear in the table of contents. Right? If there's any difference in wording, your reader is going to be thoroughly confused about where she or he is supposed to go. All right? So I should be able to pick up that report, turn to the table of contents, and know exactly where I'm going to find each part of the report by looking at that table of contents, because the wording is exactly the same as it is within the body, and there's a page number to tell me where to go. All right. Okay, so here we have the front matter that does have to have page numbers on it, those lowercase Roman numerals. First of all, a list of tables and figures. This is separate from your table of contents. The table of contents tells me about the text and where I can find text on different topics and subtopics. The list of tables and figures tells me where I can find your graphics within the report. You do have to acknowledge each of them just as much as you have to acknowledge the parts of the report. So you have a separate page that follows the table of contents, and on that separate page, which is called List of Tables and Figures, you list each table or figure if you use more than two. All right? If you don't use more than two, then you don't need this list. But as soon as you use more than two, and I would expect in a report of this complexity, you're probably going to be using more than two tables or figures or illustrations of some kind. So if there's more than two, then you have to list each one with its Roman numeral page, lowercase Roman numeral page number. Okay? And then, after the table of contents and the list of tables and figures, comes your abstract or executive summary. They're pretty synonymous. An abstract and an executive summary are pretty much the same thing, so you can use one term or the other. But what the abstract or executive summary does is give your reader the big picture of what this report is about. So it's a summary, as brief as possible, but it does include explanation of the issue, description of the research you did, and the conclusions and recommendations that you drew as a result of your research and your analysis. All right? So this is it should be written so well, briefly but thoroughly, that I don't want to admit that this is possible, but if I don't read the report, I'd still know enough about it to be able to act on it. That's your goal in writing an abstract or an executive summary, that I actually would not have to read the report to know all the important parts of what's in it. So don't encourage people not to read the report, but that's what you want that abstract or executive summary there for. Okay, so that takes care. Oh, and by the way, that too gets its lowercase Roman numeral number. All right, and that takes care of the front matter. Now, the end matter, as needed, things that need to go after the body of the report if you need them. So let's talk words and terms, because it is very likely that you're going to be using a number of technical terms within the body of your report. And depending on your audience, you may need to do a lot of defining if your audience may not be familiar with a lot of them, or not much defining if your audience already knows a good deal about the topic and the work that you're doing. Again, knowing your audience so you know what kind of glossary you have to put together. So if you need a glossary, you're using more than 5 technical terms. Remember what I said earlier about the working definitions. If it's fewer than 5, if you've decided that there are fewer than 5 terms that need defining for your reader, then they should be your working definitions in your introduction. Either that, or you can use footnotes within the body of the text. But I just think it's easier on you and on the reader to just get that done in your introduction. But if you have more than 5 technical terms, you're going to have to put together a separate glossary and put it at the end of the report. All right. If you do create a glossary, then within the body of your text, when you use one of these technical terms, you must say it can be found, a definition can be found in the glossary after the body of the report. So announce in the report where to find the term when you use the term the first time. Okay? Please see the glossary on page whatever. And then the matter of appendices following the actual report. When do we use appendices? Usually, appendices are for large amounts of information or long documents that you think your reader would be interested in as a part of understanding the overall report, but that it's too much to actually add into the body of the report. So if it's important information, but it's just too much for the reader, if you don't want to slow the reader down, then you want an appendix in which you say you're going to add this information. So let's say, for instance, you took a survey of people, and the survey, and then you did a whole spreadsheet with survey results. You may want the reader to see the actual survey questions and the spreadsheet, but you're not going to put that into the body of a report. That would way slow down the process of reading through the report. So that would be great stuff to put in the appendix. All right? And if you do, you label it clearly. You say Appendix A for the first one, and then you give it a title. What is it? Survey questions. Appendix B, give it a title. Spreadsheet of survey results, etc. Okay? And so that's how you're going to label it at the end. But then within the body of the report, you refer to the appendix when you need to. So if you are talking about your research methodology in the body of the report, and you say, we collected data in part by speaking with 20 executives of major corporations dealing with environmental issues. I don't know. And then you would say, see Appendix A for survey questions and a spreadsheet, and see, well, let's say, start with that. See Appendix A for the survey questions used. And then later you say, we gathered, the information that we gathered through these surveys was really interesting, and then you start describing it. But then you would also say, see Appendix B for actual data, the spreadsheet of the actual responses. Something like that. So, you label each appendix clearly, and then you refer to it within the body of report when it's appropriate to refer to it. Okay? And finally, very, very likely, if you use any outside sources of information, you must have a page of references. And it's the final part of the report. It uses APA style to cite every outside source of information you will use. Okay? So, there you go. That's the parts of the analytical research report, and I wish you luck as you move forward with yours.